This day has been given to us as a gift from the universe, a gift from God, a gift from life itself, and it is a gift that is beyond what we could create or earn. It comes to us whether we deserve it or not. So let us receive the gift of this day with gratitude for it and so many gifts, with humility for our shortcomings, with resilience to face the challenges ahead, and may we receive it with hope that we will continue to transform our lives and to transform our world.
Good morning, and welcome to our virtual worship service here at the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. And with apologies for not being able to show the video for that first hymn, but we are glad that you were able to join us. I'm Reverend Eric Posen, interim minister at this church. I'm pleased to be here with Lee Hartman, our music director, on piano, and with Mike Patton in our audiovisual booth. This is a congregation where there is much happening, and as many of you now know, there is something very big and good happening. As was announced at the end of last week's worship service, this church that has been in transition for almost 2 years since the retirement of your previous senior settled minister now has a candidate for your next senior minister, and it is, of course, the person currently serving as your associate minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan. Now, it's a tradition in our Unitarian Universalist churches for the gathered congregation as a whole to have the authority to select its minister, and that's why this congregation chose from among its ranks a ministerial search committee that's been working diligently to bring us to this point, to make the final selection based on your understanding as they heard it from you of what you were looking for in your next minister. And the final say goes to the congregation as well. So to give some time for discernment, we traditionally have a week. We often call it candidating week, where the prospective senior minister will preach 2 Sundays in a row, and there are meetings in between times. And that is going to happen, albeit in a different way. We are, of course, in this time of pandemic, so while we are not gathering in the building, there are nonetheless numerous opportunities coming up to gather virtually. And because it's virtual, we found that extending the time is helpful. So our candidating week will essentially be a week and a half, and it's actually starting later this week. The first gatherings are this coming Wednesday. Now, those of you who are on our email list received an email yesterday, and there was a link near the top of it to a page on our website that lists the schedule for all of the gatherings, many of which are open. Some are focused on specific subjects, or a couple a meeting with specific groups in the church. Please take a look at that, and you'll see links to the Zoom meetings for most of those as well. And one thing that we'll be doing differently for the next 2 Sundays, because November 15th and 22nd will be the 2 Sundays that Reverend Nathan Ryan will be preaching his candidating sermons for this congregation, there's going to be an opportunity for a little different kind of gathering. Still online, yes, but in addition to tuning in via YouTube, as we're doing now, there's also going to be opened up the next 2 Sundays a Zoom room. Now, we'll be broadcasting the YouTube feed through the Zoom room. It'll be the same thing, but this will give an opportunity for people to watch together, to chat with each other online beforehand and a little bit after. There'll also be one of these open gatherings following worship the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, shortly after worship ends, will be the official congregational meeting starting at 11:30 a.m. on November 22nd. And that meeting will be for this congregation to vote on its new senior minister and whether you will call Nathan Ryan, Reverend Nathan Ryan, for that. So I hope you can join together for many of these opportunities. It's an exciting time in the life of this church. And there are other things happening as well. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Reverend Nathan Ryan, for an announcement on a very different subject, which we're going to offer via video right now. Thank you for being here.
So this is just a quick announcement to let you know I am standing on our official outdoor chancel, and those are our pods that we're going to use for worship. So what you need to know about this is if you can go to covidactnow.org and click on East Baton Rouge Parish, and look, if we stay in yellow all week, we're going to do outdoor worship at 4 o'clock on Saturdays here. These are the pods. So what'll happen is, well, come with me. So I just got out of my car, and I'm gonna, I guess, walk backwards. There's gonna be a table right here that you'll sign in on. And you sign it, well, you're gonna wear your mask when you do this. No one's around, so I can take it off. You sign in so we know who's here so we can do contact tracing if we need to. Then an usher will help you go to your pod. Come with me, let's go to a pod. Also, right along the sidewalk, these pods are reserved for people who have mobility needs, who want to be able to sit here. You'll bring your own chair. We don't provide chairs. You'll sit in the pod. You will, here, let me turn around. You'll watch worship right there on the chancel, and then you'll go home. The things you should know: we will not have bathrooms available for this because the building is closed. You have to bring your own chair. When it ends, we will sort of dismiss you to go back to your cars. And we want to have this happen. We really do. We just need the cases to be low enough. You'll stay in your pod. You can stay with your family, whoever is sort of in your not disease circle. Whoever's in your, you're sharing a household with, or you're sharing, whoever you normally share air with, do that here. All right, here we go. Those are our pods. There's our chancel. Hope we can get together sometime soon. Bye.
Well, the children were excited, though a little confused why they were traveling so far without their parents. It was a cold day at the airport, and all these different parents had brought their kids to take off on this airplane. And they'd all been reassured. Their parents were letting them know that this was going to be very exciting for them. They were going to get to meet a lot of new people in a different country. And that the parents would be following along soon after. And that they'd be together again soon. It'd just take them a little while. The kids would get settled ahead of them, and then they'd be there also. The kids even noticed that there was an American woman there who was putting some things on the plane as well. This was in Europe. It was in a city called Prague. And this American woman was putting containers full of letters. This was back before the internet. And the phones really weren't that great to get from Prague to other countries at that time. So the best way for people to communicate was to write out letters by hand and send them. And this American woman had helped a lot of people collect letters to be sent to people in other countries. And those were going on the plane with them as well. Some of the parents were crying a little, but they all seemed so happy for their children. And so the kids got really excited and stayed really excited as they got on the plane. And eventually the plane took off. And it was a cloudy day, so soon the parents lost sight of the airplane as it went into some low clouds. And that's when the sadness overwhelmed the parents. And part of the story is a very sad story. This did actually happen in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And the date that plane took off was March 14th, in the year 1939. The reason that's an important date is because the very next day, March 15th, 1939, the German army invaded Prague. The Nazi army invaded Prague. Many of these children who were flown away on the Kindertransport, that's German for children's transport. Many of them were Jewish children. And their parents knew that the Nazis were coming and knew that it would not be safe for their children or for them. They weren't able to get themselves away in time, but they had this chance to take their children to this Kindertransport. And that flight got the children to safety. And most of the parents, of course, never saw their children again. Most of the children never saw their parents again. And that part of the story truly is sad. But there are two parts of the story that are good news, that truly are happy. One, the most important, is that most of these children got to live long and full lives. People had helped arrange for them to have safe places to stay when they arrived. They were landing in London, and some of them stayed in England, and some went to other places, but they were all raised safely and free from the Nazis and others who would try to harm them. The other bit of good news was that the woman who put the mail on the plane was a woman named Martha Sharp. She had arrived in Prague just like 3 weeks earlier with her husband, Reverend Waitstill Sharp, who was a Unitarian minister. And they were helping to coordinate relief efforts and working with other groups who were doing so, including this group that arranged the Kindertransport for the children.
That's why they were able to put the letters from refugees and people who hoped to become refugees, to leave the country. They were able to put those letters on the plane to travel with the children. And the Sharps went on to help form a group called the Unitarian Service Committee. We now call it the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, or UUSC. It's been in existence now for 80 years, helping people around the world, just as Martha Sharp and the people who arranged for that children's transport were helping people even back then. It's a good reminder that even under hard times, times that feel dangerous to some, we can always do what Mr. Rogers, who many of you have heard of, used to advocate in hard times, to look for the helpers. And I hope that's something we can all do in hard times and in good times.
We have a tradition in this church of placing stones in our chalice to mark the life transitions that have impacted us here. I've one to lift up in advance, and this is to honor the death of a cousin of one of our members. The member is Liz Hamlin. Her cousin, Elaine Chicatano, died on November 3rd. I know that many of you who are gathered with us virtually today also have occasions you would mark. We invite you to type into the chat box next to the YouTube screen what and who your stone would be for. I'll place the stones in behalf of those of you typing in your life transitions. And per our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we light a flame in our chalice. With these words, I invite you to say with me, with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is a symbol of the power of love.
It was an odd request for the man to make as he began his career as a professor and a scholar. But granting that request wound up defining much of his life's work. The man's name may be familiar to some of you, James Luther Adams. Reverend Adams had been born in 1901 and had already served for a few years as a Unitarian minister, served two different churches in Massachusetts in the late 20s through the mid-30s. When Meadville Lombard, the Unitarian seminary in Chicago, came calling, they sought to hire him as the new professor of theology. Adams agreed to take the job, but on one condition, that they wait a year before starting him in the new position. For that year gave him an opportunity to study abroad in Europe first, a time to deepen his own scholarship before becoming a professor. And that year in Europe, mostly in Germany, changed his life. And it deeply impacted not only the entire course of his theological work, but of Unitarian Universalism ever since. The year was the academic year of 1935 and 36. And there was something else happening in Germany at that time, of course. The Nazis were in power and had already actively begun oppressing Jews, squashing political dissent. And Adams did not stay on the sidelines while he was there. He became involved with the Confessing Church movement. That was the underground Christian church in Germany that, while it was theologically more conservative than Adams and many of his fellow Unitarians at the time, it was politically engaged actively in resistance efforts against the Nazis' brand of fascism. Using his home movie camera, he filmed confessing church leaders, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who later would be executed by the Nazis for supporting a failed plot to assassinate Hitler. Adams also filmed leaders of the German Christian Church, the supposedly liberal denomination that had state support at the time. Well, theologically, they were liberal, but their engagement with Nazi ideology and oppression ranged from complacency to vocal support. In the words of Unitarian historian Alice Blair Wesley, Adams returned to the United States more convinced than ever that the tendency of religious liberals to be theologically content with vague slogans and platitudes about open-mindedness could only render liberal churches irrelevant and impotent in the face of the world's evils. And, she added, he stated his convictions loudly and frequently. And it would be hard to overstate the influence that James Luther Adams had over Unitarianism, now Unitarian Universalism, ever since. Significant percentages of Unitarian and UU ministers for two different generations studied under him at Meadville Lombard until he retired in the late 1970s. Thus, he is by far the most well-remembered and often quoted of 20th century UU theologians. As for his critiques of Unitarians, well, he was not alone in those concerns. We UU religious liberals do still take our share of criticisms for vague open-mindedness. And occasionally, those criticisms have merit. But the legacy of Adams' theological guidance is an ongoing and deep drive to bring our faith commitments as UUs tangibly into the social arena, opposing the forces of oppression and injustice that Nazis and other fascists embodied then and now. Here in the U.S. in the 21st century, this movement manifests, this fascist movement rises up primarily with a virulently racist and xenophobic kind of rhetoric and violence that is focused on a militant white nationalism. The most prominent display of this particular brand of fascist hatred happened a little over 3 years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. And whether rightly or wrongly, these fascists have felt empowered by the election 4 years ago of the current presidential administration, as evidenced by the dramatic rise in such racist and xenophobic hatred that started the day after that election. Now, please note, I am not speaking against or for this president, but I am speaking against how certain fascist groups have responded to his election in the last 4 years. And as I record this sermon on Friday morning, following the 2020 presidential election, its results have not yet been determined. Perhaps by this Sunday morning it will have been determined, perhaps not. And that, in part, that's why I will be delivering the final portion of this sermon live in the sanctuary from the pulpit. But regardless of the outcome, we as Unitarian Universalists in 2020 find ourselves in the midst of a fascist resurgence over the last few years. Will we respond with complacency and a bland tolerance, as did the so-called liberal German churches 85 years ago? Or will we follow the call of our influential theologian to advocate in solidarity with those whom the fascists would oppress and brutalize? This election week is an excellent time for us to explore the implications of these options, which I'll begin doing shortly by making two controversial statements. I'll be back soon.
I invite us now to join together in a deeper time, a time of prayer, a time of reflection. So sit back, let the tension fall away from your muscles, the cares and concerns drift slowly away from your mind. And as you do so, may you find yourself reaching deep within, reaching far beyond yourself to connect with that which you know as sacred. Let us pray. Spirit of life and love, God whom we know by so many names and mystery beyond all of our naming, we have gathered together following a week of many surprises and much uncertainty. This national election, however we as individuals may feel about the outcome of that election, nonetheless left so many wondering, anxious about what would happen. And many of us find, in some cases, new reasons to hope, in other cases, new reasons to be anxious as we look forward. Help us to be grounded. Help us to find that which connects us to what we value most deeply, and help us continue in this changing political climate to find ever new ways to work towards the values that lift up our lives and our faith most fully. So may it be for us all. Amen.
From the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. Last August, the call came for faith leaders to show up in Charlottesville, Virginia. Local faith leaders, including Unitarian Universalists, called others to join them in fortifying an effort to stop white supremacist violence descending on their town. I didn't hesitate, because at its best, our faith teaches us that the humanity of every single person is threatened when we let those who dehumanize others go unchallenged. And because I know that it is not enough to intellectually want to change the world, then shrink when that call challenges us to take risks protecting one another. It was important to show up and follow the challenging call of our faith to embodying a fierceness of love in the face of hate and violence. It matters. It matters that we not forget what happened in Charlottesville in August of 2017, for it revealed explicitly both the roots of the reality of today, as well as what is at stake in these times.
I promised two controversial statements. The first, James Luther Adams is an anti-fascist theologian. And the second is that Unitarian Universalism, though we fall short of this sometimes, at its best, ours is a thoroughly anti-fascist faith. And that may sound like an anachronism. Isn't fascism an ideology that died in 1945, was defeated? No. And I'll add that I'm not sure that fascism is an ideology at all. Perhaps it's more of a broad, if vague, social political instinct. The historian Robert Paxton agrees, and he described this as the instinct to reject any universal value other than the success of chosen peoples in a Darwinian struggle for primacy. And that struggle stands in direct opposition to our principled affirmation of every person's worth and dignity, our call to promote justice equitably. Adams would say that what is ultimate for fascists is that struggle for success of their people, whom they believe to be better than all other people. And he would add that that struggle, that false belief, functions for them as their God. And the struggle for white supremacy was on full display in August 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. But also, so was the anti-fascist response on display, with armed anarchists coming to the aid of nonviolent faith leaders. UUA President Susan Frederick Gray was one of those faith leaders. You heard her reading earlier where she spoke of that day in Charlottesville. In another part of that same sermon, she adds, when dozens and dozens of white supremacists came marching down the street, chanting and yelling with shields and helmets, wooden clubs and sticks, coming right at faith leaders and peaceful protesters. Anti-fascist groups stepped forward to protect the faith leaders. One other faith leader, well known, who was there was Reverend Dr. Cornel West. He can be seen in the front of this line of marchers. That photo was taken that very day in Charlottesville. And Dr. West also has stated publicly that he believes Antifa, the anti-fascist groups that were there that day, saved his life in Charlottesville. Even though many people, including several UUs, were injured that day, and one local anti-racist activist, Heather Heyer, was killed. Now let me note, even among those of us who affirm that everyone's inherent worth is equal, there's much consternation over anti-fascist activism, what's commonly known as Antifa. Many oppose what they inaccurately think are Antifa's inherently violent tactics, and some draw a false equivalency between the oppressive violence of the Klan and the Nazis versus the violent responses to injustice of some Antifa activists. But contemporary Antifa in the U.S. is not a single organization or even a coalition. It's a broad social movement that opposes fascist organizing. Sure, there are groups in other countries that are named Anti-Fascist Action, or that language is equivalent. The first was founded in Germany in 1932. But Antifa in this country is a moniker that anyone can claim, and I would argue claim it proudly and boldly, for any and all manner of strategies and tactics to oppose fascist tendencies and oppressions, be they in the legal system, the legislative arena, the media, or out on the streets. I know some people, perhaps some of you, lament the lack of civility from the anti-fascist movement. And we can have a legitimate debate over the appropriateness and the effectiveness of violence as a strategy or tactic of those anti-fascist groups who call on us to #punch more Nazis. But I recall Susan Frederick Gray's insight that, quote, "Our faith teaches us that the humanity of every single person is threatened when we let those who dehumanize others go unchallenged. I will tell you frankly, that's why I, for one, do not oppose punching Nazis. And I frankly praise the loving incivility of the Antifa activists who defended Susan Frederick Gray, Cornel West, and other faith leaders that day. But when I call Unitarian Universalism a thoroughly anti-fascist faith, I'm not making a comment about violent demonstration. Not for it, not against it. I mean that our underlying principles of just and equitable relations, of inherent worth and dignity, of respecting the democratic process, these principles guide us to a broad-mindedness on matters of belief, yes, but they do not call us to open our minds so wide that our values fall out. Because while there's no list of banned beliefs for UUs, our values mean that we work against those beliefs, those forces in our society that themselves work to deny inherent worth, equity, and justice. So our question for ourselves as people of faith is, what does it mean for us to be guided to, called to engage this work? And I'll ask that question in another way shortly.
From the Prophethood of All Believers, James Luther Adams. A church that does not concern itself with the struggle in history for human decency and justice. A church that does not show concern for the shape of things to come. A church that does not attempt to interpret the signs of the times is not a prophetic church. We have long held to the idea of the priesthood of all believers, the idea that all believers have direct access to the ultimate resources of the religious life, and that every believer has the responsibility of achieving an explicit faith for free persons. As an element of this radical laicism, we need also to affirm belief in the prophethood of all believers. The prophetic liberal church is not a church in which the prophetic function is assigned merely to the few. The prophetic liberal church is the church in which persons think and work together to interpret the signs of the times in the light of their faith, to make explicit through discussion the epochal thinking that the times demand. The prophetic liberal church is the church in which all members share in the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it. Only through the prophetism of all believers can we together foresee doom and mend our common ways.
And as we come together to worship, we come together in community with and support for this gathered community of the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. I invite you to take an opportunity to show support for this gathering, for this community in a tangible way as we prepare to receive the morning's offering. And we receive it in these times of virtual worship in a couple of different ways. There is a phone number to which you can text the word assist, and I believe that phone number will be put in the YouTube chat shortly, as will the address of the web page on our church website on which you can give online. We invite you to give generously as the offering is now received.
I asked a few minutes ago what it could mean for us to work against those beliefs and those forces that seek to deny inherent worth and dignity, seek to deny democracy, justice, equity. There's another way to ask the question. What does it mean for us to be prophets? The term may surprise you. It's one that popular culture twists would have us believe that a prophet is a fortune teller, someone with mystical claims to knowledge of the future. But that's a perversion of the role that was played by the ancient Jewish prophets, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Amos. Yes, they claimed divine insight, true. But rather than dictating holy edicts down to the word, or articulating detailed predictions of the future as apparently or supposedly derived from God. Nonetheless, these prophets understood themselves to be inspired, yes, by God, to read the signs of the current times in which they lived in light of the divine insights they were offered. They were not divining the future so much as they were naming the likely negative consequences of what was then current behavior. What would happen unless the people of Israel changed their ways and resumed living by their covenant with God. James Luther Adams took this understanding of being a prophet and drew it to its logical conclusion. He spoke of a church being free when it enters into covenant with the ultimate source of existence, that sustaining and transforming power not made with human hands, and then adds later, the goal is the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, the one for the liberty of prophesying, the other for the ministry of healing. In other words, yes, it is the work of a church to serve the people who are part of it, to aid them in finding their own healing and wholeness, to serve one another and be present with one another in these ways, and also it's to proclaim freedom, to proclaim justice and equity and worth and dignity and democracy, yes, for all. Not for some, for all. So being a prophet today means reading the signs of our times in the light of our ultimate values that I've named: worth and dignity, justice and democracy. And as my contemporary colleague, the Reverend Peter Friedrichs puts it, the role of the prophet, be that an individual or a community of faith, is threefold: to name injustice, to proclaim a hoped-for future, and then to go out, get our hands dirty, and work toward making sure it comes to pass. So naming injustice means articulating what the injustices in our world and in our community are, but also proclaiming a beloved community. That's the term that Martin Luther King helped to popularize. He learned it from an earlier American philosopher, Josiah Royce. It's an understanding of community writ large with the ultimate values of that community so deeply woven into it that people cannot help but live out of those ultimate values. It often sounds utopian and has never fully been achieved, and yet it is nonetheless a vision towards which we can and do work. So in a time and an era when a particular brand of fascism has risen, which argues for a virulent kind of white supremacy, our prophetic work is not only to oppose that, but also to be watchful amongst ourselves for those subtle elements of a culture of white supremacy that we would not proclaim, but that nonetheless have influenced us in ways that we would not intend, but that still have dramatic impacts on so many who are marginalized in these days and ages. Naming the systemic injustices that arise from them, proclaiming an anti-racist vision that moves us towards a genuine and equitable multiculturalism, and then doing the work amongst ourselves and in our communities to root out white supremacy, be it from opposing the Ku Klux Klan to seeing those subtle elements that may be embedded in the culture of our congregations and working to change them so that they don't continue to subtly reinforce racially segregated and stratified status quo. It's not always fun work. It's uncomfortable to recognize when we've gone astray in these ways, but when we do, we truly are embodying more justice for all. And I'll say more about what that looks like amongst us and at large in this particular moment of time soon.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within earth. It is time now. It is time now that we cry. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to be in love. In this great turning we shall learn to be in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within earth. It is time now. It is time now that we cry. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love.
Well, the times have changed, even from when I recorded the sermon 48 hours ago. And it's fascinating, has been fascinating, to watch yesterday the online responses of so many people to the announcement of the winner of this year's presidential election nationally. The responses have ranged from elation to grief, and there are so many who are seeing the world differently today than they did just over 24 hours ago. And those who think that everything has changed in the last 24 hours are, I'm sad to say, simply mistaken. Whatever good and bad is yet to face this nation in the light of the election that's just been held, it is nonetheless true that the forces I've been describing in our nation throughout the sermon today, the forces of fascism, of oppression, of racism, those forces are not going away, whether one believes they are or not. And in this changing political climate, we know that we have work yet to do, now in a new mode. Whether better or worse, I leave to others to decide, but a different mode of work to oppose the racism, the xenophobia that fascists advocate for and our faith advocates against. And there are going to be moments when it's going to be uncomfortable, because the work includes the hard challenges. And I say this for myself as much as anyone else. I certainly don't find it comfortable, never have, to confront racist jokes or comments or attempts to marginalize others. And yet, the more that I do step out of that comfort zone and do engage that work of pushing for those around me who others would marginalize to be affirmed in the fullness of their humanity and afforded every equal opportunity as others to participate in our collective lives, including our political lives. Every time I do take those uncomfortable steps, I'm living out my faith. I'm living out my commitments and my values. And the challenge that stands before us today is to celebrate those of us who would do so, to mourn those of us who would do so, and through both, to continue working for our vision of beloved community, naming the barriers to it, proclaiming the fullness of it, and taking the tangible steps we can take to bring us ever closer to fulfilling it. And in this work, sometimes uncomfortable, but always hopeful, may we find deeper commitments in our community to oppose those who stand for injustice and to support greater justice in our lives, yes, in our church, and in our world. So may it be for us all. Amen.
Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us in prison, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for children of our children, keep the circle home. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us in prison, circle for children of our children, keep the circle home.
We do hope you'll join us for our virtual coffee hour. The link to the Zoom room will be available on our church website. And as we conclude, we pray that as you go forth from this sacred time, from the many sacred places in which we have gathered, that you go knowing yourself to be graced with the blessings of freedom and wholeness. For though our worship now ends, so begins anew our service. Let us go forth and find ever new ways to serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Thank you for coming. Go in peace.